We're recording this on August the 14th, 1996. We're talking with Robert Schnuelle, Bob Schnuelle, who has had the opportunity to be a management executive, an air personality, a star, if you will, on a lot of radio and television stations in Nebraska for a period of time. He's been president of the Nebraska Broadcasters Association, on the board of the Nebraska Broadcasters Association. He's a member of the Nebraska Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame, and in a particular perspective of time in broadcasting in Nebraska, he was one of the key players in terms of the way that the business operated. Bob, to start out with, just to refresh us a little bit, how you got into broadcasting, with which station, when?
I work for KGFW in Kearney, Nebraska for a year. I was the farm news director. Then I learned of the fact that Dr. F. Wayne Bursar was building a TV station, and I decided I would apply to get a job, and I got hired, and I put the station on the air, worked there for about a year, and when they found that I made more money than the general manager, I got fired a day before Christmas, and guess what? Dwayne Watts was the general manager, and he also got released. And so I worked. The reason I made so much money as that day and age, they operated on the talent system, and I got all of the commercials that were done. And those days, they didn't worry about the clock as much as we do now. And in other words, ad-lib commercials, if you gave a minute 10 or a minute 20, or in the case of the Western shows, which were all live, and those days there wasn't any video tape, so you had to have either film or live programming, and that made for some interesting stories. One story I particularly like to tell, because it was actually true. I was doing the sports, and I noticed that the cameraman, Marsden Gary, was his name, and I noticed that he suddenly had departed for the parts unknown. Unbeknownst to me, I was doing the sports, and I saw out of the corner of my eye a pet skunk. Of course, in those days, we had the station 13 miles south of Kearney and a big cornfield, and I just figured that the skunk got loose, and I couldn't do anything about it. The cameraman, fortunately, locked the camera down, and he is long gone. And so I kept one eye on the skunk and one eye on the camera and explained the situation verbally, and come to find out it was a setup, and the skunk was descented, and a friend of mine from the town of Kearney had set it all up, and that's when broadcasting was a heck of a lot more fun than it is now. But
Bob, this is KHOL TV
yeah.
in Kearney at the time.
Okay.
And the call letters have since changed to KHGI.
Yeah.
But it was KHOL TV, and Dr. Brewster was the so-called
Yeah.
flying physician
Yeah.
who was actually from Holdridge, as I recall. And the building that you describe as 13 miles south of Kearney is sort of near the town of Axtell, as I recall the situation. And you went there when the station went on the air in 1953.
Yeah.
And so your work at KGFW would have been in 1952, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
It was, I got paid the whole sum of $40 a week, Larry.
But the talent fees helped out, didn't they?
But there was no talent fee in radio.
Oh, and television.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean,
And
I understand.
I made, I don't know what I got, $5 or $6 a show. And those days, you really added up. But obviously...
Who were some of the people on Channel 13 at the time? I think you mentioned Jack Lewis as being
Okay,
one of
Jack Gilbert, who is now in TV, educational television in South Dakota, I believe. He's an executive in that branch. And I mentioned Marsden Gary was a cameraman. He now is a salesperson with a local pipe company.
Okay, and Jack Lewis?
Jack was in television, and he got disillusioned with the broadcast industry, television. He was tried and true radio person, and the last I knew of Jack was when he went to Grand Junction, Colorado, bought a radio station there. He has since died many years ago, and he was the fellow who most influenced me to try to go and be what you can. I think to praise, he was the Rush Limbaugh or broadcasting. Rush Limbaugh says, whatever you do, do it the best you can do, then walk away from it, having known you tried.
Honest John, was that the name of the show?
Yep.
Honest John's show was a well, it was sort of like an early talk show, wasn't it? Okay, and he was the host.
He was the host, and to fill time, we cut pictures out of magazines long before color came to town, and we had to fill it up with something, because there was very few networks shows on the air in those days. The old days, you were lucky if you had 4 to 5 hours of network program. The other, you're on your own.
So when you were with KHOL TV, you were the sports announcer, you did commercials. Any other responsibilities that we ought to pass by?
I was the so-called production man, and I worked about 7 days a week. The longer I worked, the luckier I get.
How long did you stay with KHOL TV before you went to KHAS TV?
About a year. We went on the air on, I believe, Christmas Day.
1953.
I got let go in 1954.
And then is that time you went to Channel 5,
Okay.
or roughly speaking in there?
Channel 5 went on the air 40 years ago, and I worked at KHAS radio for the time period
Before it went on the air.
before it went on the air, and I worked also at Sitter's Furniture Store selling furniture.
In Hastings.
Yep.
And then who was the manager of KHAS radio at this point?
Dwayne Watts.
And he became the manager of the television
Yes.
station at that point.
And he subsequently, John Powell took over. He's
Radio.
not with us, with the station anymore. And Irv Cinemanite, which was an engineer at KHOL. He went to work for Dwayne Watts, and I brought him over to television when I started KGIN TV. Mr. Ebel hired me a year early.
This would have been about 1960?
Yes. We went on the air in 1961. I learned a lot from Dwayne Watts, and I think he was good for me, but I had a bitter disagreement with him at the time, and we agreed to disagree. I told him that I had decided to resign, and I thought that would be better for both of us. I had no idea what I was going to do, and Harold Sotterdam said, if you ever decide to leave Dwayne, and call me. I quit on the Friday night, and I called Harold on Friday night, said I'm leaving Channel 5, and I asked him what I was going, what he would suggest, and he says, I'll call you back. And 30 minutes later, he had a interview scheduled with a station in Sioux City, Iowa, and he also had an interview set up with Mr. Ebel, and at that time, Dwayne Holman was the general sales manager of Channel at 10, and I said, okay, Harold, and I went up to Sioux City, Iowa for the interview, drove up a miserable hill, and decided right then and there that wasn't my cup of tea. And so I said thank you, but no thank you. And I drove directly from Sioux City to Lincoln, and I met with Jim and Dwayne Holman, and I said, I'm out of work, and they said, we're thinking about Channel 11 and Grand Island, and so I worked. I said I had to check with my wife, and at that time we had a baby girl that we adopted, and I said I'd had to talk to my wife, knowing full well that I was going to take the job. And so I called him back on a Wednesday, as I recall, and said yes, and the rest is history.
Now, what was the job that you took with putting KGIN on?
Took the job out state sales and development work. I took the job a year earlier than I would have been offered the job, but that's the smartest move I ever made. I just came from having a department head meeting. We have had for years and years, ever since I've been with channels 10 and 11, a weekly get-together where we go over budgeting. Every department had a budget, and you had to explain why you were over, and I generally was over, but he was nice about it, Mr. Evil. He sometimes you got their honey in a crack, but nothing that I couldn't handle. One thing that John Fetcher instilled in all of us.
John Oney, who was the owner of the station.
Yes. He instilled in us a sense of belonging. That's why you never saw anybody leave John Fetcher. Rarely. UK, Bob Taylor was there for years and years. Mel Maines, whom I saw today, and incidentally, he looks super. I think Jim and Paul Jensen, who was later the manager of the station, and we all got along with the program. I used to get in the dangerous arguments with Bob Taylor over philosophy of news. He said the second coming of Christ was only worth 45 seconds of film. Actually, he believed that news was still supposed to be the who, why, what, and that's it.
And Bob Taylor was the news director for many years, and from the middle 50s until about 81 or so, as I recall.
Till his death.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mel Maines was there from about the time you joined the station, from about
I joined
61
the
until
station in September, and he joined the station about less than a year later.
Now, Bob, one of the things that the stations, the Fetzer stations, asked you to do was to become active in the community and active in the Broadcasters Association. And so one of the things that we want to ask you to talk a little bit about is the years that you were the president of the Broadcasters Association, and I might just put in here that you actually were president longer than most folks because you did sort of a term and a half because your predecessor, Frank Scott, was transferred out of the state, and sort of you moved in as president-elect and then had your own term for a year.
Yes, I replaced Frank Scott, who incidentally I admire tremendously. He's had a long and successful career in his own right.
What was it like? What was the situation when you came to that office?
Well, hectic. I was president of the broadcasters the same year that I was president of the Chamber of Commerce. So I did very little work outside of chasing down the calls that I got from the broadcasters and the disgruntled merchants that I was trying to represent as a member of the chamber. And of course, there was the opening of the gigantic mall in Grand Island that same year, and I presided over the opening ceremonies, and I think if I hadn't had the stroke, I wouldn't be here today, because I was geared up for early demise from this world. I used to smoke like a steam engine, drink like a fish, and you can cut this out if you want to, but I'm serious. I have, my family was most supportive of me after the stroke. I had the stroke after I
after your term as president,
yes,
you completed your term as president for both of those groups, as I recall.
And I had a lot of fun, Larry, doing what I wanted to do, and I did it to the best of my ability. And
now, Bob, at that time, the person who was the executive director of the Broadcasters Association was a man named Frank Fogarty, who the presidents always had to lean on. Talk a little bit about what Frank Fogarty and executed policy that you and the board came up with.
I have the utmost respect. If Frank Fogarty wouldn't have been the executive director, I wouldn't have said yes to the job. That's how much I appreciated him. He was a real gentleman broadcaster, and I mean that sincerely. And Bud Pence later replaced him, and I respect Bud. And in fact, I turned over the reins of the Broadcasters Association. And
Bud was the president the next year after you did this, and later became executive director sometime in the 1980s.
I have the great deal of respect for Bud Pence. Bud was the commandant of broadcaster who said it like it was.
You guys weren't very shy then. You, Frank Scott, Bob Schnuelle,
Yeah,
Vince, you weren't not shy guys at all.
And I think my people, saying Jim Abel, Carly, and ultimately John Fetzer, appreciated it also. They didn't always agree with anything I said, but once I said it, they backed me up 100%. Maybe Jim Abel would wait 3 months to say something that he disagreed with, but he always closed the door, made sure that the secretaries didn't bother him, and we thrashed it out. Not belligerently, but matter-of-factly, like you're talking to me now.
Now, Bob, when the Fetzer organization decided to add Channel 11 to Channel 10, that was opening up a whole different market. And essentially, you were, as I understand it, the employee to start out with. You were the whole show.
Well,
with the engineers.
And Al Panic did the camera work for me he was still there when they decided there wasn't a market for one-arm paper hangers. And
now, when you were there, you mentioned that you were sort of in outstate development, but as the job moved along, you essentially did some air work, you did some news work, you did some sales work. You were in essence in charge of the operations of the Grand Island station. And,
yes.
And so the job evolved over a period of years to the fact that it was in its own right a complete television station. It was, of course, part of the 10-11 operation and because of the way it was construed, but you had the responsibility for bringing that whole area of Kearney, Hastings, and Grand Island in terms of viewers in. Okay. Now, you said when you meant with Jim Ebel as a department head, what were you responsible for in terms of to him?
I was responsible for the Saturday night news for 11 years. I drove, never missed a newscast in that 11 years, blizzard or anything. And I believed in it. I appreciated the opportunity, and I did my best, which was...
Well, you had good ratings.
Yeah. Of course, the lead-in soul called Gunsmoke happened to be an awfully nice lead-in.
In the days of CBS being very powerful network.
Yeah, oh yeah. And we enjoyed the highest ratings, much to Bob Taylor's disgust. And I'm sure it wasn't all me. And I laughed about it. I said, ha ha ha, we debate you. We're the top rated news show on the air.
Why did they have you as a guy who was really in charge of the Grand Island stations coming to Lincoln to do the news?
Because that's how Mr. Ebel wanted it. He had a vision of being integrated in the community.
So this polished your image
for
the Grand Island people because
in immense manner. I couldn't think of a better opportunity, and I did my best, which, as you know, give or take, I never dreamed that we'd ever get to be seen by over 78 8,000 people. That's as many people as West Nebraska football in person. And I never let that enter my mind. I would be scared to death to step out in front of a crowd like that. But I didn't ever let that enter my mind. I did my job as best I knew how, and I figured if I was pretty successful, and by the time my son and daughter were growing up, and I had to spend more time with them, and unfortunately, the stroke caught them and the worst possible time. I had just in the middle of constructing a new home on the corner of the golf course, and I lived in it, but we couldn't keep it.
Now, Bob, as I recall, you got into broadcasting because of your interest in being an on-the-air personality.
Yes.
And of course, essentially, the stroke interrupted that, but you came back from almost completely unable to speak to being able to do a quite normal job in terms of a presentation. Not as days when you were on the air and so forth, but you must have had a great determination to be able to pull that back just because you knew how to do it.
Well, it wasn't that simple, Larry. First 2.5 years, I struggled to recall 40 words, maybe. I could make my wants known, like food, and which I still do. And
but you've come back far better than most people have with that kind of situation.
Thanks to the veterans and the administration hospital, and there I met a man by the name of John Ashford, who gave me the same test that I had taken before for the private doctors. And he said, "What were they treating you for? Aphasia?" And I shook my head, yes. And he says, "I don't believe that's right. I think you've got one of the most severe cases of apraxia that I've ever run across." And he said, "Work with me for an hour a day, 5 days a week for 2.5 years. And he says, when he was finished, use it or lose it. I still have to think of everything before I say it, and I still screw up on the simplest of one-syllable words, and I can say condominium, aluminum, and all the tough ones, and screw up on the simplest of terms. And
but that's because also, since you have the background as an air personality, you have a much more sophisticated appreciation and understanding and probably goals as a part of that. Now, before we run past our tape time, I want to talk about some other prominent broadcasters that you've indicated are folks that you've run across in your career and so forth. And a couple of those are radio folks from the western part of the state, Dave Young and Joe DiNatale.
Yeah.
Both members like you of the Nebraska Broadcasters Hall of Fame.
As was Bob Thomas.
Yes.
And he was a prolific writer of letters. If you didn't get a letter from Bob Thomas weekly, you hadn't checked your mail.
Bob Thomas from WJAG
Yes.
in Norfolk.
Yes.
an interesting guy because his father, as you know, was one of the founders of the Broadcasters
Yeah.
Association. And Dave Young, of course, from Sydney,
Yeah.
was a person who also, in some ways, I suppose, his career was earlier than yours because he started out and was older than you.
Yeah.
But somebody that you ran into several
Oh,
times in
yeah.
terms of a variety
Ibs
of things.
Young, his wife, is still in Sydney, and I stop and see Ibs whenever I go through. My father still lives in Longmont, Colorado. He's 88 now, and
So you can make the trip there and
Yeah.
stop and
I drive myself, and while my mother was dying of cancer, I spent a great deal of time in both Longmont and Loveland, where they used to live.
Now, Jody Natale from North Platte is sort of an exuberant personality like you. And talk a little bit about Joe.
Well, the thing I liked about Joe is you never had any doubt about where he stood on anything in the world. He and I had our disagreements, but I respected him immensely. Larry, in fact, the old gang was much better than broadcasting today. Is much a bottom line business. If you don't produce, you're out.
Now, Bob, did KGIN make money when you were there?
No. Actually, no.
The 10-11 company made money.
Yep.
And that's how it was set up, wasn't
Yep.
it?
But Jim Abel had a dream of seeing various people, Miller and Payne, and what was the other one? Well, Miller and Payne, particularly, they wouldn't have dreamed of setting an operation up in Grand Island.
Mm-hmm.
But the new mall, and I don't know.
The Channel 11 signal was important in terms of their...
Oh, yeah.
their
We used to have Miller and Payne on the air daily. They even bought a newscast. And we can get all the people on that wanted on the newscast. And I used to do Kenny King's commercials for Union Loan and Savings. I didn't, he recommended me to get my second house loan. And he helped me to get it from Jim Peltzer.
One of the things that's important, I think, that we ought to cross here is the Lincoln Hastings Kearney market, which was something really that was invented by Jim Ebel and his associates, you included, in the early part of the time. And how is that significant in terms of what it did for the stations and the viewers and the audience measurement?
I think it was vitally important, not only commercially, but generally. I think you have to recognize Mr. Ebel's philosophy was what was good for Lincoln was doubly good for Grand Island, Hastings, Kearney, Holdrege, Ravenna, and all points west. We even built a station outside of North Platte.
A translator, a low-power repeater station.
Yeah. And even to this day, we still have repeater stations all over Valentine. We get into Valentine and North Platte and McCook.
Some people would say that the ability for the Big 1011 signal to reach, I think at one point it was described as 76 out of 93 counties in Nebraska, was a unifying approach for people in Nebraska.
Yeah, absolutely. I would subscribe to that philosophy in its entirety.
What was in the period of the 1960s, when you were first getting Channel 11 going out there and getting people to pay attention to it and so forth, what was the man on the street, the woman on the streets, feeling towards this new signal, particularly, although it had kind of been there before, this was really a new powerful signal?
Well, the most criticism I had to deal with was why Lincoln had to be involved at all.
Oh.
We should be able to be big enough to have our own station, let alone taking on to a bunch of people from Lincoln. But now they have accepted, and in fact, there's an independent station on 17 whom Fox Network is providing programming for. They don't have any local news whatsoever, and to date, I don't even know where the transmitter is located.
And this is KTVG,
Yeah.
I think, is the.
I have never met the gentleman or lady, whomever it is. I don't know where their offices are.
Now, a couple of other names that are familiar to you are the people from the Stewart Radio Group, Dick Chapin
Yes.
and Roger Larson.
Both of them, Dick Chapin particularly, he and I didn't always see eye to eye, but I respected him as a commercial broadcaster more since I'm out of the business, and in a sense less of a competitor. And he used to sew up at morning one set of clothes, the afternoon another set of clothes, and really wild in the evening. And we used to kid him about having traveled all over the world to get his wardrobe.
And Roger Larson?
Yeah, Roger Larson was a quiet sort of a guy who didn't get ruffled at anything or anybody. He just did his job as Dick Chapin wanted it.
And you also indicate that you'd like to talk a little bit about Roy Lenwell from McCook.
Yes. Roy Lenwell was one of my favorite broadcasters. He again said it like it really was, not what he thought you wanted to be.
I'm just looking at the names of some of the folks that we're talking about, Bob. And of course, one of the things that I did when I introduced you is a member of the Nebraska Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame. And most of the folks that you have talked about here are folks who are also in the Nebraska Broadcasters Association Hall of Fame. Frank Scott, Paul Jensen, Jim Ebel, Roger Larson, Dick Chapin, Bud Pence, Dave Young, Jody Natale, Bob Thomas, Frank Fogarty, Roy Lenwell, Bob Taylor, Harold Sutherland. Amazing group of folks there, because there aren't that many of them who are part of that.
I appreciate the fact that the same year I went into the Hall of Fame, Mr. Sutherland was an inductee too.
That is interesting, given the fact that now that you've told the story about how he was instrumental in terms of some points in your career.
He is a real broadcaster in the sense of the word, howbeit he was never on, he was always a sales rep. And I have the deepest respect for Harold Sutherland, and I think Harold has endowed the ETV Commission for a sizable gift.
Now, the thing also, Bob, that we need to pay attention to here a little bit in terms of the way that we're looking at this is to talk a little bit more about how the Broadcasters Association in the 60s and 70s was part of the social process, the political process, if you will, and so forth. Recall anything about the interaction with people like Jim Exon, who was governor in those days, and so forth?
Jim Exon was a personal friend, and he appointed me to the Judicial Nominating Commission, and he was a real friend. Bob Crosby was too.
The governor in the 50s.
And Charlie Throne.
Who was once executive director of Broadcasters and later became congressman and senator.
And I saw Charlie getting on the plane to attend the Republican National Convention. Coincidentally, I watched it all on ATV. So I listen to a lot of books. I have a tape machine and watch television very little. I have my favorite news shows, and I give up on television shows per se, and they all are the same plot, and I prefer news shows where I can argue with them, albeit one-sided. But no, I am on the Talking Book Board. I just got appointed, which incidentally, a blind fellow, an attorney for the, I believe, the Aeronautics Association is chairman of, and I got to meet him the last time we met in Grand Island. I just recently been appointed. And that's all my political deals.
When you were starting out in the business as an air personality and production person and so forth, did you see yourself moving into a position where people who were the senators and the governors were your personal friends?
Yeah. Well, not
that fast, but it happened.
As a matter of course, naturally, we interviewed them. I didn't try to argue with them. There's day and age beginners, political beginners. That's why I listen to C-SPAN and ETV, because they have a minimum of argumentative people. Don't you see? Republicans and Democrats the same thing will happen to us from now when the Democrats get together for their big shindig.
Bob, during your years in the television business, what were the things that stand out to you as the biggest variables, the biggest changes? Were they technology issues? Were they regulation issues? Were they ratings issues? Were they things that had to do with program ideas? What things that were?
All of it, the above. Television is moving so fast. As Mel Main said today, that his wife works for the leading distributor of TVs and radios in Beatrice, and he says she just got back today from an RCA seminar, which ideas were put out and fantastic developments in the future. He says even today's extended I'm getting
You're thinking like the digital formats,
yeah,
and the extended screen.
just like you said when you called to set out this interview, we'd be able to call it up 200 years from now.
Okay.
That's beyond my wildest dreams.
That's because you can remember before videotape.
Yeah. I almost said the slang term.
When you dealt with television, when it was black and white television, before it was color television, but still it was a great innovation at that point. How do you compare what people thought of television as, wow, pictures going through the air the first time, to what you are now talking about in terms of some of the innovations that you see now?
Oh, Larry, it hasn't been that well. In one way, it's been an interesting career. Beyond my wildest expectations, I can predict there's a whole new future in digital programming.
But Bob, in 1953, nobody believed that you could put pictures through the air very
Yes,
easily.
yeah.
Okay. And if you walked down the street in Kearney after you'd been on the air at Channel 13, didn't people look at you like you were something from another world?
Yeah. Absolutely, and I still get people after 19 years stop me on the street and say, I used to watch you every Saturday night.
Well, but before that, of course, you were not only on Channel 10 and 11 for those years, but you were also on Channel 5 in Hastings and Channel 13 in Kearney and so forth. So
I'm the original outstate Nebraska.
Yes, you are.
Some good people are too, but I'm one of the originals, and there's very few of us left.
But you went on the air with Channel 13 in Kearney when it went on the air, right?
Yeah.
In 1953.
In fact, I announced it the first time I ever went on the air. I put Channel 13 on the air. I again put Channel 5 on the air. And I was instrumental in putting Channel 11 on the air, albeit it's a bit different situation. But no, everybody, including the people at Channel 13, 5, and Lincoln, KLIN, KGIN TV, was responsible for my not only being here, but for my limited success as a broadcast journalist. And I think that my family deserves some of the credit, because after the stroke, they wouldn't let me quit. And my wife gets after me sometimes. I don't want to do it, but I know that she's loving my son, who incidentally is a leading horticulturist for Bachman's. He lives in Minneapolis, and my daughter is going to be a college art professor when she graduates from college at Fort Hays, Kansas. So at that time, I think I will be ready to relax. And
you know, it's interesting, Bob, because one of the things that I've known you over the years is that despite the fact that you haven't been on the air for a while, you have retained entirely all of your abilities to be relaxing in front of the camera and to handle all of the kinds of things that are part of it. You just have the gift to be able to do that. In spite of the stroke, you still have the abilities to handle all of the on-air stuff. That's a gift.
Well, thank you, Larry, and people like you, with your deep love of the business, I appreciate it more than you will ever know.
We're coming about to the end of the time, Bob, that we barred for you for, and so I need to ask you, is there anything about the business that we haven't talked about that you would like to talk about? We've gone over most of the names that we've talked about here, and you've given us a lot of information.
Well, no, in a way, I'm sorry to say broadcasting isn't as much funny anymore. The bottom line has taken over the business. If your ratings are done, you're out as far as the national programming is. And I don't particularly like the way the business is apparently headed, but I see nothing but good things for the future.
Well, Bob, we'll just hope that for some time when everybody looks at this tape that they use Gunsmoke as the lead-in, and we'll be all right for the ratings.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. We've been talking with Bob Schnuelle. This is August the 14th, 1996. Thank you.